My name is Cassie Hanson. I'm the editor of Artichoke magazine, and I am really excited about this topic because it's one that I chose because I selfishly wanted to learn about how these three individuals went from, being architects and landscape architects and designers and then branching out into new things, very creative things. I have a side hustle myself, which is ceramics, so always good to hear how other people have done it. I am joined here today by these three lovely ladies. It's an all-female panel. Yes, love that. Tal Armstrong is the founder of Don't Tell Charles, creator of the original concrete cake, and a leader in the contemporary buttercream cake movement in Australia and across the world. She has a background in landscape architecture, and she uses her love for design to push the boundaries when it comes to cake design. So if you haven't seen her case, jump onto Instagram, where she has like 200,000 followers watching her every move and every cake, and they're absolutely amazing. Jane McKenzie in the middle there. After completing her architecture studies, Jane enjoyed a 20-year career in the field of heritage architecture, working across Australia and the UK. In 2014, she enrolled in a Bachelor of Fine Art at the National Art School in Sydney, and now makes ceramic sculptures full-time, inspired by architecture. And Jane and I know each other outside of confines of this industry because of our love for ceramics and us being ceramicists, and we live we're neighbours, kind of. So very pleased to have Jane join us for this panel. And Megan Hounslow is an accomplished interior designer known for creating enriching and intuitive spaces across commercial, institutional and residential sectors. Parallel to her design work, Megan has recently unearthed her passion for oil painting, which she studied prior to interior design. This emerged during the isolation of the pandemic and a desire to distract herself from anxiety in the constant noise of today's busy world. And yes, a bit of a trigger warning, I think COVID's going to come up a few times, so watch out for the C word. Now, for two of them, for Tal and Jane, they both do their creative pursuits full time, and Megan is balancing being both an interior designer and a fine artist, so it'll be really interesting to hear how each of them do what they do. So without further ado, I'd love to just get stuck into things. We might start with you, Tal, and then we'll work through you all, but tell us a bit about where you were at in your career beforehand, how long had you been at it, and then when and how did cake making start?
Okay, so my journey is it didn't really start because I was still in landscape architecture school. So I studied journalism at Melbourne Uni. Didn't finish that because I'm like, that's not my thing, when you're 18-year-old and you think you can try everything. So I was supposed to start architecture. And long story short, my auntie who I lived with at the time threw out my interview letter by accident. So I'm like, okay, landscape architecture is next on the list, so I'll just go to that interview. So I got in, I was studying landscape architecture, I knew nothing about it. And about 2.5 years in, I just thought, no, this is not for me. Like, I've always been creative, but I was and am still a maker. So, it's design on the computer, and the schooling is gruesome, as all of you would know. So I actually didn't finish my degree, and then I started working as an owner's corporation manager in an office. So it used to be called body corporate, so you manage buildings. It's a really boring job. People just ring up and they complain all the time. No one ring up to tell you how good the day is. So that's when I started baking as kind of like an outlet. And I think it was, that feeling that people love what you did, you make them happy, people tell you, oh, this is delicious, it's amazing, and that's how it keeps you going. So that's how I started with what eventually turned out to be my side hustle. So I started selling cupcakes and macarons on Facebook, and I did that while I was working at the office. And then about a year after that, I said, you know what, I'm just going to do it. So I opened a cafe, so it was like a specialty coffee house and desserts, And that was like, I'm like, I'm not going to go back to school and rack up more debt when I don't actually know what I wanted to do. So I thought, instead of going back to school and do a business degree, I'll just do this. I'll get into the same amount of debt, but then I'll get real life experience in business. And so that was literally it. Like I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was doing. But I thought, I'll probably learn a lot more. And worst comes to worst, I just have some debt, either way. So that's pretty much how I started.
Amazing. And Jane, you've had a 20-year career as a heritage architect. What drew you to ceramics? How did that all begin, and what was that shift like?
Is this on? Yes. I started doing architecture from, straight from school, and did it because it's such a common story. You love art, but you do maths and sciences because you think it's the responsible, serious, proper thing to do. So I kind of started doing architecture, but always had art on the side. It was what I sort of used to say, it kept my sanity kind of thing. And so I did a lot of, in my spare time, I'd paint, I'd print make, I'd do whatever I could, until I got to a point. Was this question, where were we in our career, or how did we transition? Where I was, yeah. So after finishing my architecture degree, I worked for a couple of years. I always specialised in heritage because I loved history. Specialised in history right from the get-go, and after a couple of years in Perth, I went to the UK and did a Masters in Building Conservation. Worked in Scotland for a couple of years doing that. Came back to Australia, worked for private practice, heritage practices, National Trust, government agencies. So the last 9 years I was working in Sydney for the National Parks and Wildlife Service. We have an incredible portfolio of historic buildings and structures that they're responsible for. So lighthouses, all the mountain huts and the snowies. They've got defence heritage. There's an amazing portfolio of heritage buildings that I was giving advice on how to maintain and conserve those buildings. So I did love it. It was great, but there was always this nagging thing that I wanted to be making art. Yeah.
And then how did that come about? Did you just say, okay, we're gonna do this art story?
Yeah, so living in Sydney at the time, I did go and sneak into the National Art School, which is an amazing campus. So for anybody who's a heritage buff, to go into the old Darlinghurst jail with the most beautiful buildings. So I thought, one, I want to study here, and it was a great curriculum. It's sort of equally balanced between very heavily studio-based, but also lots of life drawing and lots of art history. And it just made sense. That's what I wanted to do for 3 years. I was at a point in my career where I could afford to work part-time and study. I was studying full-time, but I could work in holidays and take the odd contract in between. So, yeah, I did that. Thought I was going to be majoring in painting or printmaking. The painting studio, it was like going back to architecture school. It was all guys in black t-shirts who were too cool. I thought, I don't really want to do another architecture degree, I think. And the ceramics studio was just warm, fuzzy, family kind of thing. And then suddenly the 3D thing made sense to me, that it was a bit like small buildings that I could make from clay. So yeah, I fell in love with clay at that point.
Amazing. We'll get later to how you went to pharmacist.
Yeah.
Megan, you're currently balancing two things: your interior design practice and also your painting practice, which was born out of the pandemic. Tell us a bit about how that all began and how you managed to do both.
Well, I'm sure everyone can understand how bored we all got during lockdowns. Really, I studied fine art before I did interior design, and I didn't really have the confidence to follow it through, and I didn't feel like I had the depth of knowledge coming straight out of school. No. And travelled, I've worked in the industry, interior design, and run my own business, which has been really rewarding. But I think art is a very different thing. It's a creative outlet. You don't have any brief. You can do, kind of what comes naturally and what's organic. So it just sort of became unearthed during that very very hectic but very suffocating time, I guess. So yeah, it's happened. It's just sort of just come up, and I think that if you are a creative person, you know, if you aren't expressing yourself in one way or another, it just sort of it boils to the top. So I think that that's sort of, for me, it was just in my studio on a Sunday afternoon, pouring with rain, stuck in Melbourne, you know, and very much. Right, well, I think I've got now the headspace to paint. So, yeah, that's how it happened.
It saved your sanity, I'm sure.
Yeah, it certainly has. And I think that it's a very, very different kind of thing to produce art for people as opposed to interiors. I mean, interiors it is incredibly rewarding, but it's a different joy, and to actually bring something that comes out of nowhere to life creatively. So no, it's been wonderful.
A question for Jane and Tal, I guess. You had these, I guess, careers or these trajectories where you had a safe, stable job, and then you have to take the plunge into something that's not so, you know, a bit of a risk. What was that like? Was it scary? Was it a decision you laboured over, or you just went with your gut and went for it? Something you tell?
Well, for me, I was really young, so when I started the cafe, I can't really remember, 9 years ago, so I was 25. So I didn't have a lot to lose. You know, the job was stable, but it wasn't something that I ever thought that it was going to be what I was doing. It was just for an income. So I did stay at the job from first year while we opened the cafe. So I worked 2 jobs. But for me, yeah, it wasn't something, like I have a daughter, I have a 2-year-old now. So if I was to pivot now, it would be a much scarier decision. But I've always acted on my instinct and my feelings, and I guess now that my husband's completely the opposite. So being with him long enough, it kind of pulled me that way a little bit. So if I was to pivot now, I'd be scared and I'd do it differently. But back then I was 25, I had nothing to lose. So I'm just like, yeah, let's do it. Just did it.
Jane, how about you? I mean, you had a whole career.
I was 43. It's quite different. I was like too old to get kind of like, well, you're at this point in your career where you know that if you don't do it for a couple of years, you can still get a job again in it later. You know, when they used to say, don't not work in this field for a few years because you'll never get back into it. I was at the stage where I knew I would always be able to get work, so that's a good safety net in itself. But it was always like, well, if not now, when? Is what I do. With the fine arts, just wanting to study more of that.
And I guess I want to hear a bit about your work, your creative studios, what they look like. Paint us a picture of where you bake the cakes and where the ceramics happens, and where the painting happens. Messy, clean.
Well, I'm working in my back shed in my garden at the moment. It's interesting because I had an office and I had quite a few staff, and I made a shift away from that about 4 years ago, just to kind of just take a bit of a break. I think when you've been in this industry for 25 years, I'm sure everyone can understand if you're in the design profession, it pays its toll because you're really just there to provide a service, and you want to do the best you can, but there's a lot of constraints around whatever you do, your budget, your time, and it just gets really stressful. So I stepped away, and I have a studio that I work from home, and it was sort of collided with COVID, so I did have an office for a while in the city just on my own, but that's where my studio is now, and it was very, very neat and tidy, and now it's splattered in paint. So it's sort of a very different thing, and yeah, so that's kind of me. But
do you find you work? You're a messy painter, but perhaps a much more organised interior designer. How does your brain work in those 2 different ways?
Look, I mean, I create a big bomb site and then I have to clean it up. So it's sort of, it's a bit like an explosion with the paint. But it's a little bit like that with interiors too. It sort of explodes, ideas explode, and then it's about sort of bringing it all in. So yeah, that's sort of the way it works for me anyway. So
Jane, paint us a picture of your studio. I've been there, but
Yeah.
these people haven't had the pleasure.
Studio is the heart. It really is the heart of what you do. You have to love where you are. So after I managed to stay at art school for 5 years, and in the last couple of years had a gorgeous studio there that I really missed. So living in Sydney, fairly expensive options and real estate type kind of. So I was renting a shared space that was a half-hour drive away. I was having to listen to somebody else's music. I was having to breathe in somebody else's dust. Yeah, and that was one of the big motivators. That was, I really want my own studio. So that was a huge big tipping point for me. Was actually working out how I could afford to do that, which was selling and getting out of Sydney and living regionally. So now I could afford my own studio, which I built in my own backyard, and it's a bigger space that I need, and it's glorious. It's great. So it's pretty multifunctional. I can adapt it as necessary, but I've got the nice north-facing windows that I wanted. I've got the big sliding doors. I've got my own kiln.
Very neat and tidy too.
When you visited, it was. Yeah.
Jane's out in Castlemaine, so she's out in regional Victoria, and now I guess the music you have to listen to is the birds and bees.
Yeah, and I love it. It's good.
Tell, what does a commercial, is it a commercial kitchen? Is it much more creative than that? What does it look like?
Well, the state of my studio at the moment is in boxes. So I did have a studio and I had it for 7 years, and it still breaks my heart to talk about it. So what happened was I was pregnant with my daughter in 2019. So we still had the studio, and the plan was so I stopped doing the cake side of things and taking orders. So for those of you that don't know, I actually have 3 parts to my business. So there's the custom designer cakes, and then I also teach people how to make them. So we do workshops in the studio every Sunday. There was a point before I got pregnant where I was flying to Sydney. I went to London 3 times, Singapore. So I was going places, teaching people how to do these things. And because our following is worldwide, there was a lot of demand for online courses. So that's the other side of the business. So we have online courses as well. So I was fortunate enough to be able to make this decision when I was pregnant to go, okay, I'm going to slow this side down because it's quite physically, we had staff, but I was just so exhausted at that point that I just said, I just got to stop something. So the production side was stopped, and then, the plan was to always come back, and then COVID hit. And like naively, when you don't have children, you just think you pop one out and then you just take it to work with you, and it didn't work out like that. And even if it did, I kind of didn't want to. So I returned the lease in 2020. So fortunately, my space at home, we have quite a big kitchen, but I hate it because I had everything laid out in my studio. Every time I walked in, I'll be like, oh, I love this space, Yeah, I had it to the point, I had 7 years, so, I really built it to the point where it was a space that I loved working in. And I guess hate is a strong word, but every time I've had to get used to working from home again. So I'm still not making cakes for orders, but I still create, just to, I guess, keep the brain going for content for the teaching side of things. But I'm hoping to reopen the studio next year. So right now my studio are in boxes.
You're doing the other full-time job, which is being a mum.
So I'm still running the online school side of things. So that's been, I guess, my full-time job for the last 2 years. Yeah.
So I'm interested to hear about what a typical day is for each of you, especially, I guess, we might start with you, Megan, in terms of balancing both. Do you have a full day, designing interiors and then pop over to the shed and splash some paint around, or how does it work? When do you have the painting time?
I haven't quite worked that out yet. It's look, I think things are changing now that we are in lockdowns, and also people, their expectations are changing a lot too, because it did get very quiet there for a bit of time, or a long time, as we all know. But it's very much about sort of prioritising what needs to be done first, and I guess because the art is something that it sort of comes, it's a happy place really. And it comes very fluidly. It's not like there's a brief. I mean, you have your own briefs, but so you can actually have a glass of wine and maybe start painting at 8 o'clock at night. You know, as I'm getting older, that's not really working as well. But a typical day really is just kind of prioritising what needs to be done and then setting aside time to do whatever. I mean, with the art, there are commissions, and I've just had a little exhibition, and there's another one I'm preparing for. So it's really about, you know, kind of squeezing everything in, really, at this point.
How much time are you spending on your art per week?
Well, I was spending probably half. Now it's sort of probably weekends and evenings painting. But it just depends on, you know, what the demands are of the practice. Yeah, so that's sort of where
It sounds like a constant juggle.
it is.
Adapting.
It is. Yeah. Anyway, it's all good.
And Jane, typical day in the studio, you walk in the morning and what happens?
There's no typical day.
You can say that.
Yeah, every day starts with walking the dog through the bush, which is just a glorious privilege. Yeah. I divide the time as I need to, so I've got other sort of streams that I do a little bit of teaching. I've just started to get into public art commissions, so each day might be a bit different depending on with timeline, what needs to get done. Build up to an exhibition is quite different, so then that could be, you know, long days, 7 days a week, preparing for an exhibition, getting all, you know, leaving plenty of emergency time in case everything explodes in the kiln and I have to remake it. To then I'll go really slowly and casually for a few weeks afterwards. So yeah, just very organic as required.
And Tal?
Well, so when I used to have the studio, the days were quite structured because you'd have, like, and this is what I teach as well, you have to have a real system to be able to do things effectively and efficiently. So, you know, for example, Monday was the day off, Tuesday and Wednesday was baking, and that's all you do on those days. And then, you know, Wednesday you could be doing decoration. So that every day would add up to the lead up on the weekend, which is where all the cakes, so delivery would be, you know, Saturday or Sunday. My typical day now is pretty much waking up with my daughter, getting her ready, and then jumping on the computer. So, so because my business has been purely the online school in the last 2 years, I do most things on the computer because we're a digital business now. So, you know, sometimes I'm filming in the kitchen, but most days it's in front of the computer, which is why I'm really keen to reopen the studio and get back. You know, the reason I always said, and I say all the time, the reason why I opened the cafe is to get away from the computer. And somehow I end up there regardless. And I do a lot of creative things, you know, content, marketing, but I guess it's not how my brain's wired. The endorphins doesn't get released as much as if I'm making something and actually see it finish. Whereas if you're working with online content, it's never an end. Like, you do something and it's not like you step back and you go, oh, that's a great video. I don't get that. Like, I get my joy from seeing something that I know that I've created there and then.
Kind of those more important administrative things that are all part of the whole, you know, part and parcel of having a business, but it is kind of those necessary evils, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear, and we might start with Megan, you've obviously all come from architecture and design backgrounds. How has that influenced what you're creating?
Well, that's a tricky one. I think a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is very much inspired by sort of nature, and there was a bit of time where there was a lot of time where I was spending out in nature during, the last couple of years, doing lots of big long walks. I'm really fortunate to live by the water, so that's kind of my biggest inspiration, is sort of drawing from what I see in sky and water and landscape and how they all collide, seeing the movements through. So that has been a source of inspiration. But I think having an idea of what people like, because I think creating work for In Good Company was, an interesting project, where it's like, what's going to sell in a furniture showroom? And I think the work, it's fairly neutral, but it's also there are also pieces that sort of evoke sort of a sense of calmness. We all love our fabulous kind of pops, colour and controversial sort of art, but my work is probably not so much in that realm yet. It may become more like that. It's just the beginning. But yeah, I would say that having the confidence to really be bold with colour has been a big thing, and also really understanding, what will work within an interior in that environment. And I hate to be calling myself a wallpaper artist, but it does feel a bit that way when your work is in a showroom. But I think it's really all about what the viewer takes back from the work.
Imagine, because your art was born out of the lockdowns and pandemics, it is such calm, beautiful, calm colours and calm scenes, and I'm sure that's just what came out of you during all that inner turmoil.
Well, it's just really trying to find respite, I think, and look, I think it was really just having the time to really be able to explore. And I think that, as I said before, if it is something that you really want to do, it will happen, and you've got to go with it, and trust and just start. And that's the biggest step it was for me, is just really getting the brush and starting again and going, let's just do this. And I think, have I answered your question?
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah.
Jane, your ceramic works are so architectural.
Yeah.
Was that a conscious decision? Did it come naturally? It was what came out of you instinctually? How did that come about?
It did. I didn't connect the fine art and the architecture to start off with, and it was actually only while you study a fine art degree, you have to there are all these different sort of projects. And it was when I started building, you have to do a large slab-built structure kind of thing, and all of a sudden I thought, wow, this is a small building, and this is fun.
Model making.
Yeah, it's exactly like model making, clay slabs. And suddenly realised that the previous career, or the sort of coexisting career, could feed into that in a way that I hadn't stupidly sort of connected before. Yeah.
Sometimes it's the most obvious things, isn't it?
I know, it is. Yeah.
And Tao, obviously your cakes are so, beautiful sculptures and structures. And do you think there's instinctually some of that landscape architecture background sort of finding its way in?
So this goes back to ages ago when I first started to teach myself how to bake and make cakes and stuff. And I don't know if you guys make cakes, but it's very old school. It's very, very old. So I got to a point where I got good enough in my skills, but I didn't know how to kind of express what I wanted to outside of what I've learned. And then I watched this episode. It's the first episode of Chef's Table on Netflix, and it's on Massimo Bottura, and it showed him getting inspiration from this art exhibition, you know, and then I'm like, wow, so if he could translate that into food, then I could be looking at, you know, what I'm actually interested in, so interior architecture, and that's where I started breaking the boundaries between, you know, cakes don't have to be just cakes, so you know, I created the concrete cake, and it literally looked like a block of cement. And it goes with anything. You can put flowers on it, you can put shapes on it. So a lot of my inspiration comes from architecture, interior. What I learned from landscape, you know, I don't know, what I learned from landscape was more the design skills. So I use that a lot, using, you know, how to design on the computer, you know, kind of how to look at things, compositions, things like that. But I don't think anything in terms of the landscape itself translates into my work, because it's not something that I'm passionate about. Yeah.
I'm interested to hear what, in your creative practices, for all of you, what sort of resources do you use to support your business both creatively and practically? What's a constant source of inspiration? Do you surround yourself with people, or how does it work for you to stay in there and stay creative? Go for it, Megan.
Well, I think I still do practice interior design, so that is very much, you know, financing the fine art, but it's also having the connections in the industry, having the clients, and having always had such a passionate interest in fine art and painting that, you know, opportunities have just sort of opened up by just putting it out there. So definitely, it's like opportunities like this. It's when I was painting, Inglewood Company contacted me during the lockdown and said, "Look, we want you to do an exhibition for us. We want to feature your work." And I was blown away. I was like, "Fantastic!" I mean, it really gave me a goal to work towards, and that's where it started. And now I'm sort of becoming more involved in group exhibitions. I've got prints available on my website, and also I guess it's really with the experience that you've got in having been in the industry. I think that's really helped kind of open up opportunities to take this next kind of direction further. Yeah.
One feeds the other, it seems.
It does. It totally does. And I think, that drive and passion behind having that kind of real desire to do it really sort of motivates you, I guess.
And Jane, how do you stay creative? What do you make sure you're doing or seeing or looking at?
You need to tribe. You really need to tribe. Yeah. So studying is a great way to find and meet people who do similar things to you, and they're great support for you is past students and people and teachers and people who share their knowledge is really important. And I mean, we met because I relocated. I didn't really have a ceramics tribe in Victoria. I was following you on Instagram. I loved your work, and we made kind of similar work, and realised you're a town away from me, and said, "Hey, let's catch up." So, yeah, creating that network of support is really important. But it stays there on Instagram too. So there's still other people in Canada, the UK, that you have a bit of an Instagram relationship with. Yeah, they'll say nice, supporting things to you. You'll be inspired by what they do. It's the people around you who are really important.
I think, I can't agree more. I mean, just even that constant feed of things on Instagram and Pinterest and stuff. Just one little image or something might, for me at least, take me on a whole trajectory of weeks and weeks worth of work just because of one building I saw that I want to make a ceramic piece. That sort of,
absolutely. Or one technique,
That's it, exactly right. Yeah. And Tal, when you were making cakes, where did you go to for inspiration? Like, how did the cement cake come about?
Yeah, you can pretty much spend your whole life on Pinterest. I love Pinterest. Yeah, so when I was still making cakes, things kind of just, because one thing was happening and then it leads to the next and to the next. I never found myself short of inspiration. So, you know, you do custom work for people and they'll come to you with certain themes or certain briefs. And then, you know, I guess, I don't know, if I'm making, I feel like that machine it's being oiled. So I will constantly, I guess, find myself not short of inspiration. But that's a point now where I'm kind of stuck at a little bit, because for my work, there are two sides. There's me, the cake maker, the cake designer, and then there's me, the teacher. So that's two sides of the business. And when I was doing all three, they fed into each other, you know, much the same as Megan's work. You know, one side fed into the other. So I was creating stuff, and then I was teaching that to people, and then people would be asking me how to do something, and that kind of went around. Whereas now I'm not creating as much, and I'm focused on teaching. And it's really, I find it's a lot harder to find inspiration when I'm not making things. So that's what kind of made me decide that I need to reopen the studio. Not so much for, you know, for the business in terms of financial, but it's more for myself to keep that inspiration going, because I kind of, in the last 2 years, I think I've depleted that tank. You know, having a small child and COVID, and, you know, like, you never see anyone. And I get such an energy from teaching people in person, whereas online school, you film it beforehand, and it's a lot of admin. You're just, you know, we build a big community, but it's an online community. It's different to actually being in the same space with people and feeling energy. Yeah, feeling the energy. And so I'm in a spot where I'm struggling for inspiration at the moment. I'm never short of inspiration to make something, but then I get frustrated because I can't get to making, you know, things all the time. So that's where I'm at.
Well, maybe on that, I guess, we've only got a little bit of time left, but I've got two more questions for you all. What do you find, what are the major challenges in what you do? What's been surprising to be doing this full time for you two and going back into this? What have you found surprising or challenging, particularly with your creative practices?
Well, it's time, definitely time. So that just takes you back to just really disciplining yourself and saying, right, I'm going to allocate this time. This is the time I'm going to put into the work, and it's not until you make that decision and commit to it. You know, like, it's so hard. I understand with, you know, having all the distractions, but once you start making, it's incredible how the creative process just evolves, and it just evolves and grows and grows. It just comes out of somewhere. And that's it's pretty. Look, I found it quite it's been quite a spiritual kind of awakening for me to really paint. And you know, I had some health problems a couple of years ago, and it's been such an incredible healing process as well, to just feel really hopeful about, you know, just creating something that's come from a place that, you know, you're happy with, and you feel content with it, and to actually create that work and to see other people enjoy it is worth more than specifying, you know, carpet and furniture. And so, look, I think it's a different thing, and the love really drives it. And you've got,
I think
sort of where I'm coming from anyway.
I think art is such an amazingly powerful therapy, and it's so healing and all those sorts of things. And also just that when you get in that state of flow, it's an hour's passed by and you don't know the clue where it all went. It's just it's almost out of work, like it's just out of your body.
I've seen Cassie's amazing videos where they're just fast forwarded, and it looks like 24 hours of working. It's crazy.
Feels like.
I'd probably, exactly the same. It's been 12-hour days of painting, not eating, just painting. And, you know, it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful place to be there. But anyway,
It nourishes the soul, that flow state, I think. Jane, challenges and
Surprises. I was sort of thinking, as a heritage architect in a previous career, you're always honouring somebody else. You're always honouring the earlier building. You're honouring the architects who have been before you. You're respecting the building. You're doing what's the right thing. You know, one of the greatest sort of things people would aim for is so people didn't even know you'd been there. You know, if you can repair a building so it doesn't look you did anything, that's a good thing. Suddenly with clay, I can make buildings. I realised I was never like a proper, you know, what people consider an architect doing original work. I never did that. I mean, that's what I studied in architecture school, but in my career, I never designed my own buildings. And now suddenly in clay, I get a great thrill from designing and building. That's a frustrating thing about architecture is you're not building, you lose that control. You're handing it over to somebody else to make. But when I have clay, I do it all myself, and that control is fabulous. Yeah.
I'm sure it's incredibly inspiring for architects to look at the work. I mean, I was looking at your work and I was blown away by it. Sort of you know, Ricardo Beaufort meets Le Corbusier. You know, kind of like it's incredible. So it's a great meet. Like to be artistic it really informs your design, I think. And back to that question, you know, for many years it's like, you know, you sort of want to get that atmosphere in there. It's so hard with interiors to get that. When you get to the photography point, you know, it's. I mean, I'm sure Tao with your work too. It's very much. Well, you have full control over capturing what it is that you want to express, and whether that informs, you know, or inspires. That's the beauty of it, really.
Tal, we'll finish with you and then we'll have one last quick round question. Surprises and challenges in creating this cake business that you've built from the ground up, and it's a major thing now.
I think my challenge is the same as Megan's, it's the same as everyone, it's time. Like I feel like I never have enough time to do everything that I want to do. You know, and you throw a kid in the mix. And I guess that's a surprising thing. So before having my daughter, I was always go. You know, like I said, at one point I had 3 facets of a business that I was, you know, like I literally, a typical week would be, you know, 6 days in the studio, and I could be delivering a cake up until the point where I have to wheel a suitcase to the airport to fly out overseas because I'm teaching a workshop the next day. And so in a sense I felt like I had control over my time, even though I was still time poor. And then I guess, you know, call it surprise, it's mildly, I was quite a big shock for me to, you know, not be able to do that and like just really move at a really slow pace. So it's taken me 2 years to kind of just start to accept and you know, like get used to this is how my life's going to be moving forward. Yeah.
Not what I planned, but it's still.
It's been incredibly character building. Like I feel like for the last 2 years I've grown probably 50 years older than, you know, than how I was before the last 2 years, and I'm sure COVID's had something to do with it as well. But yeah, time's forever juggling.
It's that great paradox where you have a whole big long list of things to do and they're in your mind, but you also want to have a clear mind so you can be creative and have your best work. I've had such a lovely time talking to all 3 of you today, but I have one last question in case there are people in the audience who perhaps they might have some sort of creative side thing that they do and they're wondering what to do with it. Do they make it into something bigger or not? Any pieces of advice or what you wish you were told, perhaps, when you began this art practice, this creative journey?
Just start. Just do it. Just do it. I mean, the only way you can do it is by starting, and don't even think about it. Because I think if you think about it too much, it holds you back.
Reasons why you shouldn't do it.
Completely. So, if wherever there's a will, there's a way. You know that old saying? That's what it is. That's what I think. Anyway.
Very good advice. I was just going to add, do it if you can manage to do it part-time, and for a while. I was over 7 years making and still had the backup job sort of just there in case. So it's hard to shuffle, but it's a good backup. Yeah.
And tell your words of wisdom.
If I just had one advice, I realised with myself that I went into it for me. So I guess my advice would be know what you want to do it for, right? And that will dictate what steps you take next. Whether you want to pivot because you're not getting paid enough and you think that, doing something else is going to get you paid more, or whether because, for me, I've always stopped. My business has changed like 10 times during like the last 9 years. And I've been able to do that because at any given point where I felt, I've never arrived at a point where I woke up in the morning and didn't want to go to work. But when I got to the point where I'm like, I'm not enjoying this, I'm stressed to the max, and what can I stop? So I've been able to kind of listen to myself, because I didn't get into it to make money. And if that's your reason, that's fine too. But I guess if you know what you want to do it for to start with, then that will take you in a very different path to not knowing.
Well, thank you all, ladies, for sharing your wisdom and your time with us all. Please put your hands together for Tal Armstrong, Jane McKenzie, and Megan Hounslow.
Thanks.
Thank you all for joining us. Hope you enjoy the rest of the show.